In the spring of 1859, the majestic Willowbrook Plantation, nestled in the fertile Louisiana countryside, was known for its elegance and the refined hospitality of its owner. Abigail Thornfield, a 38-year-old widow with hair as golden as ripe wheat and eyes as piercing blue as sapphires, had been running the estate alone since her husband's tragic death in a carriage accident 5 years earlier. Abigail's beauty was legendary throughout the region, but it was her sharp wit and iron determination that truly set her apart. She had transformed Willowbrook into one of the most prosperous plantations in the state, personally overseeing every aspect of the operation, from planting to selling the cotton in the New Orleans markets. But behind the facade of success and elegance, Abigail carried a deep pain that consumed her day after day. 3 months earlier, her youngest son, Thomas, just 17 years old, had mysteriously disappeared during one of the plantation's festivities. The young man was known for his fiery idealism and passion for justice, traits that had put him at odds with some of the darker traditions of Southern society. Thomas was an exceptional young man, educated in the best schools in the North and deeply influenced by the abolitionist ideals gaining traction at the time. Unlike many young men of his social class, he openly questioned the morality of slavery and had begun investigating rumors of illicit activities occurring on neighboring plantations. The official investigation into his disappearance had been superficial and quickly shelved. Local authorities, all closely connected to the region's most powerful families, concluded that Thomas had fled to the north to join the abolitionists. But Abigail knew her son better than anyone. He would never abandon her without a word, especially knowing how much she depended on him after his father's untimely death. For weeks, she conducted her own quiet investigation, discreetly questioning the plantation slaves, searching every corner of the property, and following any clue that might reveal the fate of her beloved son. What she discovered would make her question everything she believed about the society around her. Through whispered conversations with loyal slaves and carefully collected evidence, Abigail began to unravel a sinister conspiracy involving some of the region's most respected families. Her son had uncovered evidence of a human trafficking ring that went far beyond the legal slavery of the time, an operation that kidnapped free people and sold them into slavery in distant markets. The most shocking discovery was that her own husband had been murdered because he refused to participate in this heinous scheme. The carriage accident that had taken his life had been no accident at all, but a carefully planned murder to silence a man of integrity who threatened to expose the entire operation. If you're impacted by this disturbing story and want to learn how this tragedy unfolded, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by activating the notification bell. Also, click the Hyper button to help us continue bringing you real stories that have shaped history. Your support is crucial to our channel's growth. Buried Secrets, the truth about the criminal network. Abigail's clandestine investigation revealed terrifying details about a criminal organization operating in the shadows of respectable Southern society. What began as a desperate search for her son turned into the uncovering of one of the most diabolical schemes in pre-Civil War American history. The criminal network was led by 4 prominent men from local society, each contributing their specific skills to keep the operation running without arousing suspicion. Cornelius Blackwood, owner of the largest sugar plantation in the region, provided the logistics and financial resources. His wealth and social influence served as a perfect front for illicit activities. Judge Harrison Wade, a corrupt magistrate with decades of experience in the legal system, facilitated the entire operation through forged documents and manipulated court decisions. He had signed hundreds of false death certificates for people who were still alive, allowing them to be sold as identityless slaves in distant markets where no one would question their origins. Colonel Richard Pemberton used his military contacts and knowledge of transportation routes to move victims safely across multiple states. His official military convoys served as perfect cover for the transport of human merchandise, and his impeccable reputation ensured that his activities were never questioned by local authorities. Dr. Samuel Moorcock, the community's most respected physician, provided the medical legitimacy needed to support the operation's lies. He issued false medical reports, declared healthy people dead, and even administered drugs to keep victims docile during transport. The operation operated with military precision, Free people, both black and poor white, were kidnapped during isolated trips or lured into traps with false job offers. Once captured, they were taken to secret locations where their identities were systematically erased through forged documents declaring them dead or missing. Thomas had uncovered this diabolical network through hidden documents he found in his late father's office. The young idealist had begun collecting evidence with the intention of exposing the entire conspiracy to federal authorities in Washington, where he believed he would find justice far removed from local corruption. But their investigation did not go unnoticed. The conspirators discovered they were being investigated and identified Thomas as the threat. On the night of his disappearance, the young man was kidnapped by henchmen working for the criminal organization while working late in his office on the plantation. Through Ezra, an elderly slave who had served the Thornfield family for decades and harbored a fatherly love for Thomas, Abigail learned of her son's terrible fate. Ezra had witnessed the kidnapping and bravely followed his captors to their hiding place in the marshes, arriving too late to save the young man, but in time to witness his final moments. What Ezra revealed to Abigail about Thomas's final days would forever change the course of her life and seal the fate of everyone involved in the conspiracy. The gentle plantation lady was about to transform into something much darker and more dangerous. The metamorphosis of grief, from grieving mother to ruthless avenger. The details Ezra revealed about Thomas's final days transformed Abigail from a grieving mother into a force of nature driven by a thirst for revenge that consumed every fiber of her being. What she learned about her son's suffering transcended any concept of civilized justice she might have previously held. Thomas had been taken to a secluded cabin in the Louisiana swamps, a location the criminal organization used to process its victims before transport. For 3 agonizing days, the young man was tortured by men who wanted to discover exactly what he knew about their operations and where he had hidden the evidence he had collected. Ezra, hidden in the dense vegetation of the swamps, witnessed every moment of the torture. He watched as the conspirators tried to break Thomas's spirit through increasingly brutal methods, seeking not only information, but also to make an example that would discourage further investigation. What impressed Ezra most, and would later fill Abigail with bitter pride, was Thomas's unwavering courage to the end. Even under extreme torture, the young man refused to reveal where he had hidden the incriminating documents or to provide any information that might compromise others who had helped him in his investigation. Colonel Pemberton had been particularly cruel during the torture, apparently enjoying the infliction of pain on an idealistic young man who represented everything he despised about the younger generation. Dr. Moorcock participated by providing medical knowledge on how to inflict maximum pain without resulting in premature death, deliberately prolonging Thomas's suffering. When it became clear that Thomas would never reveal the information they sought, the conspirators made their final decision. On the morning of the 3rd day, they brutally executed the young man and dumped his body in the swamps to be devoured by alligators, thus eliminating any physical evidence of their crime. But they had underestimated both Thomas's and his mother's determination. Before his death, Thomas had hidden all the evidence he had collected in secure locations at Willowbrook Plantation, with detailed instructions left in code that only Abigail could decipher. When Ezra finished his horrific tale, Abigail remained silent for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the betrayal and brutality that had destroyed her family. When she finally spoke, her voice was transformed, cold, calculating, and filled with a determination that would make ancient emperors tremble. "They killed my husband because he refused to be complicit in their atrocities," she said, her words measured like lines from a death poem. "They killed my son because he had the courage to expose their crimes. Now I will show them what happens when you mess with a Thornfield family." Abigail spent the next few weeks transforming her grief into something far more dangerous. She studied each of her enemies with the dedication of a general, planning a military campaign, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their families, and their routines. She also began recruiting allies among the plantation slaves, people who had lost loved ones to the criminal network and were thirsty for revenge. The plan she devised was as audacious as it was meticulous. She would take advantage of the traditional Holy Week festival, an annual event that brought together the entire local elite at her estate to exact a revenge that would echo down the centuries. The poisoned invitation Preparations for the Feast of Death. Preparations for the 1859 Holy Week Ball began 2 months in advance, and Abigail personally oversaw every detail with an obsessive attention that impressed even the most discerning observers. To the outside world, she appeared simply as a dedicated hostess organizing the most important social event of the year. In reality, each decision was a carefully placed piece on a deadly chessboard. The invitations were designed with the elegance typical of Southern high society, printed on imported European paper with gold edges and the Thornfield family crest embossed. Each invitation was personally addressed by Abigail in her impeccable handwriting, with personalized messages that demonstrated both her attention to detail and her intimate knowledge of the recipients. Cornelius Blackwood received his invitation with a special note inviting him to a private conversation about mutually beneficial business opportunities. The greedy man, who had coveted the fertile lands of Willowbrook Plantation for years, saw the invitation as an opportunity to finally convince the widow to partner with him, or better yet marry him to consolidate her holdings. Judge Harrison Wade was invited with the promise of discussing complex legal issues requiring his particular expertise. The corrupt judge interpreted this as an indication that Abigail might be in need of his special services, the same coded language he used when providing forged documents to the criminal network. Colonel Richard Pemberton received an invitation that mentioned regional security issues and the possibility of lucrative military contracts. His military vanity was flattered by the suggestion that his expertise was needed to protect the region from disruptive elements. Ironically, a reference he interpreted as an offer to help suppress abolitionist activity. Dr. Samuel Moorcock was invited under the pretense that Abigail was concerned about the health of some of her older slaves and needed medical advice. The corrupt physician saw this as an opportunity to expand his practice and possibly recruit the influential widow into his illicit activities. In addition to her primary targets, Abigail also invited their families and other prominent figures from local society. She wanted witnesses to her plans, people who could tell the world exactly what had happened and why. The estate's physical preparations were equally meticulous. Abigail had the grand ballroom completely renovated, ostensibly to accommodate more guests, but in reality creating an environment that would facilitate her sinister plans. New exits were blocked, windows were reinforced with decorative bars, and the layout was modified to create a subtle maze that would confuse any escape attempt. The kitchen was expanded, and special equipment was purchased, including a particularly impressive set of butcher knives that Abigail personally inspected. She also hired additional chefs from New Orleans, but in reality, she brought in undercover allies, people who had lost family members to the criminal network and were thirsty for revenge. Throughout this period, Abigail maintained a perfect facade of normality. She continued her regular social activities, attended church events, and even donated generously to charity. No one suspected that behind her gracious smile and impeccable manners, one of the most elaborate revenge plots in American history, was being meticulously planned. Judgment Night. The ball begins under bleeding stars. Easter Saturday night in 1859 arrived with perfect weather conditions, a crystal-clear starry sky and a gentle breeze laden with the sweet scent of blooming magnolias. The first carriages began arriving at Willowbrook Plantation as the sun set, bringing the local elite dressed in their finest finery for what would be remembered as one of the darkest nights in American history. Abigail greeted her guests in the grand entrance hall, transformed into a vision of classic elegance. She wore a sapphire blue velvet gown that accentuated her piercing eyes, and her jewelry, a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother and diamond earrings that sparkled in the chandelier light, completed a picture of Southern aristocratic perfection. Cornelius Blackwood was among the first to arrive, accompanied by his wife, Margaret, and their 3 adult children. The portly, self-assured man greeted Abigail with the arrogance of someone who considered himself superior. "My dear Lady Thornfield," he said, kissing her gloved hand, "what a splendid evening you have given us. As always, your elegance surpasses all expectations." Abigail smiled with the perfect grace of a seasoned hostess, but attentive observers might have noticed that the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, the pleasure is all mine. I sincerely hope this is an evening your family will remember forever." There was a peculiar undertone to her words that went unnoticed by the arrogant man. Judge Harrison Wade arrived in style, his ornate carriage drawn by 4 polished black horses. He brought his wife, Emily, and their unmarried daughter, Caroline, a 22-year-old considered one of the region's beauties. The judge, a portly man with an elaborately waxed grey moustache, exuded the authority of decades of judicial power. "Abigail, my dear," he said with smug familiarity, "you look absolutely radiant tonight. This ball promises to eclipse all other social events of the season." His tone carried the condescension typical of powerful men who viewed women as decorative ornaments of society. "Judge Wade," Abigail replied with a smile that could have chilled wine, "your presence always graces any gathering. I'm sure that before the night is through, long-hidden truths will finally come to light." Once again, her words carried double meanings that remained uncomprehended. Colonel Richard Pemberton made a military entrance befitting his rank, his uniform impeccably pressed and his medals shining proudly on his chest. His 2 daughters, Isabella and Victoria, were considered jewels of local society, and he presented them as trophies of his superior lineage. "Lady Thornfield," he said with a formal military bow, "it is an honor to be present in your home on this sacred evening." Dr. Samuel Moorcock arrived last, claiming to have been held up by a medical emergency that required his immediate attention. He was a thin, distinguished man with perfectly combed grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses that gave him a respectable academic air. Widowed for 2 years, he was accompanied only by his son, Jonathan, a young doctor following in his father's professionally questionable footsteps. When all the chief guests had arrived and the great hall was filled with the sound of animated conversation and laughter, Abigail ascended the main stairs and demanded attention. The silence that followed was instant and respectful. "My dear friends and neighbors," she said, her clear, melodious voice echoing through the elegantly decorated hall, "before we begin our celebration of our Lord's resurrection, I would like to share something special with all of you. I recently discovered some fascinating documents among my late husband's papers, documents that may be of considerable interest to our community." A curious murmur ran through the crowd, but Abigail could see that several of the men present glanced at each other with expressions that suggested something more than mere social curiosity. The feast of betrayal, when elegance masked the poison. Dinner was served in the plantation's grand dining room, a magnificent setting where crystal chandeliers imported from France cast golden light over a Brazilian mahogany table that stretched majestically across nearly the entire length of the room. Abigail had commissioned New Orleans' most renowned chefs to prepare a feast that would be truly unforgettable, albeit for reasons her guests couldn't yet imagine. The menu was carefully planned to impress even the most discerning palates of Southern high society. The first course consisted of fresh oysters from the Gulf of Mexico, served in mother-of-pearl shells with delicate accompaniments. Next, turtle soup prepared with French cognac and exotic spices imported from the West Indies. The main course was a culinary masterpiece, roast duck with orange sauce and fine herbs, accompanied by lamb seasoned with regional spices, fresh vegetables from the plantation itself, and a variety of side dishes typical of sophisticated Creole cuisine. For dessert, an elaborate Easter cake decorated with meticulously crafted sugar flowers and chocolate eggs hand-painted by New Orleans artisans. Abigail presided over the table with the grace of a queen, maintaining a brilliant conversation that kept her guests entertained and completely relaxed. She had strategically positioned her main targets along the table so that she could discreetly observe each of them throughout the meal, studying every movement, every expression, every sign of nervousness that might reveal guilt or recognition. During the first course, the conversation flowed normally about typical social topics of the time, the exceptionally warm spring weather that was affecting the crops, the prospects for the cotton harvest that promised to be particularly abundant, and the growing rumors of political tension between the North and South that were causing increasing concern among the plantation owners. Cornelius Blackwood dominated much of the conversation, as was his custom, boasting about his business achievements and making condescending comments about a woman's ability to manage a plantation alone. "My dear Abigail," he said during the second course, cutting his meat with exaggerated precision, "surely you must be considering finding a suitable husband to help you with the burden of managing Willowbrook. An estate of this magnitude requires the firm hand of an experienced man." Abigail smiled serenely, but those who knew her well might have detected a peculiar coldness in her eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I deeply appreciate your concern, but I have discovered that I am perfectly capable of handling any difficulties that may arise. In fact, I have developed quite effective methods for solving problems that previously seemed intractable." Judge Wade tried to change the subject, perhaps sensing an undercurrent of tension he couldn't identify. "Speaking of solving problems," he said with forced joviality, "I heard rumors that there have been some irregularities in the documentation of certain regional transactions. As a magistrate, I am concerned when legal procedures are not properly followed." Abigail's response was measured and deliberate. "What an interesting observation, Judge Wade. Legal accuracy is indeed incredibly important, especially when it comes to matters of life and death. Errors in documentation can have such devastating consequences for the families involved." Her voice maintained a conversational tone, but her eyes pierced the judge like blades. During the main course, Dr. Moorcock casually mentioned his recent trip to New Orleans for a medical conference. "It was a very enlightening journey," he said, apparently oblivious to the intense attention Abigail was paying to his words. "Particularly the discussions on new methods of medical documentation and record-keeping. Precision in such matters is absolutely crucial for maintaining public health and safety." Colonel Pemberton, perhaps sensing growing tension at the table, tried to lighten the mood with stories of his military adventures and tales of heroism in various campaigns. But even his most colorful anecdotes failed to completely dispel the strange atmosphere that was gradually settling over the dinner party. Conforme a meal progressed, Abigail observed com growing satisfaction que several de seus primary targets estavam beginning to show signs de discomfort que went beyond simple social nervousness. A special ingredient que ela havia carefully added a certain dishes estava starting to take effect. The revelation of sins, when the masks finally fell. After the conclusion of the elaborate dinner, Abigail graciously invited all guests to gather in the library, an impressive room with carved oak. Shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with thousands of volumes bound in fine leather. In the center of the room, she had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing a large desk where she had placed an ornate wooden box containing documents. "My dear friends and neighbors," Abigail began, her voice echoing through a suddenly silent room. "As mentioned earlier, I discovered some absolutely fascinating documents among my late husband's papers, documents that cast new light on recent events that have troubled our peaceful community." She opened a box with deliberate ceremony and withdrew a thick stack of yellowed papers. Os men who were CU's primary targets exchanged increasingly nervous glances. Cornelius Blackwood havia become visibly uncomfortable, sweating profusely despite a pleasant evening temperature, he occasionally pressing his hand against his stomach. Judge Wade estava developing uma persistent cough. A Dr. Moorcock appeared a star, struggling against uma severe headache, que estava causing him to massage his temples repeatedly. "These documents," continued Abigail, holding the papers in such a way that everyone could see them clearly, "detail a business operation that some of you may find familiar, an operation involving a trade in human beings, not just legally acquired slaves, but free people kidnapped and sold in distant markets where their identities would never be questioned." Tense silence descended sobre a room like uma heavy shroud. Several das ladies present appeared confused and concerned, mas os men involved in a conspiracy eram clearly growing panic. Abigail continued relentlessly, her voice remaining calm, mas carrying uma deadly coldness que made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Meu husband, como vocês all know, died in uma carriage accident 5 years ago, mas these documents suggest que his death was no accidental. Ele havia discovered this operation, he refused to participate. His integrity cost him his life." Sua voice remained steady, mas havia uma barely controlled fury smoldering beneath her composed exterior. Judge Wade tentou a stand, mas stumbled. He fell back into his chair, his face pale, his breathing labored. "Abigail, querida," Eli said, his voice hoarse, he strained. "I believe you may be misinterpreting those documents. Perhaps grief has affected your judgment in ways que você não fully understand." "My judgment is perfectly clear, Judge Wade," responded Abigail with icy precision, "especially when it comes to the fate of my son Thomas." At the mention of her son's name, Her carefully maintained mask of civilized composure began to crack, revealing the incandescent rage that burned beneath. Dr. Moorcock tried desperately to maintain his professional composure, despite his obvious physical distress. "Miss Thornfield, as a medical professional, I must insist that you are clearly under extreme stress. Perhaps we should end this discussion and seek appropriate medical attention for you." But his own words were interrupted by a wave of nausea that doubled him over. Abigail laughed, a sound so cold and terrible that it made several innocent guests recoil in their chairs. "Medical attention, doctor? Like the medical attention you provided to the victims of this operation when you issued false death certificates? Like the help you gave when you declared living people dead to facilitate their sale as slaves?" Cornelius Blackwood, agora visibly ill, is struggling maintain his composure. Tend to make his way toward a door. "This outrageous. I will no remain here a listener to these insane accusations." As his steps unsteady, Eel had to support himself against a wall to prevent falling. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," said Abigail, her voice now carrying a deadly authority that brooked no argument. "You are going nowhere tonight. None of you are." It was then that the innocent guests began to realize that something was terribly wrong with the entire situation. Colonel Pemberton, only one-dose conspirators who still appeared healthy, finally understood okay was happening. "She poisoned them," Ely said, his hand instinctively moving toward a pistol at his belt. "A woman has gone mad. He poisoned her food." "I have not gone mad, Colonel," replied Abigail calmly. "I have simply decided that justice needed to be done, and you, more than any other, will understand the necessity of justice when you learn what I discovered about my son's fate." The Testimony of Truth. Ezra reveals. Thomas's last moments. Abigail moved gracefully a large door at a side to library. He opened it wide, revealing Ezra, an elderly slave who havia served her family com unwavering loyalty para decades. A old man, com grey hair, uma face deeply lined pillows years de hard work, under a scorching Louisiana sun, entered a room com uma dignity que was surprising para someone in his social position. "Ezra will tell you exactly what happened to my son Thomas," said Abigail, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained emotion. "He witnessed everything that was done to my beloved boy." She turned to face each of the sickened men before her. "And then you will understand why my revenge is not only justified, but absolutely necessary." Ezra cleared his throat. He began to speak com a deep, clear voice, que echoed through a silent library. "I saw quando they took young Master Thomas on quay night of March. I was working late nos stables quando I heard horses approaching Pilaback Road. It was no common to have visitors at que hour, until I hid to observe what was happening." Os innocent guests listened com growing horror, as Ezra described in vivid detail como Thomas havia been kidnapped por masked men who clearly knew a plantation layout intimately. "They knew exactly on to find him," continued Ezra, his voice growing more intense. "They knew Kayla usually read no's office at late at night. This was no chance, for he carefully planned." Judge Wade. Tentou a protest, mas uma wave de nausea silenced him completely. Dr. Moorcock was agora visibly shaking, e Cornelius Blackwood havia doubled over uma chair, fighting against intense abdominal pain, que was steadily worsening. "I followed them," continued Ezra, his voice becoming more emotional as ele relived terrible memories. "I followed them a través dos swamps, a uma old cabin que I remembered from quando I was young. Foi uma place que a masters used para other things, evil things que they did a people who disappeared." Abigail intervened, her voice cold como a winter wind. "Tell them about a questions they asked me, you son, Ezra. Tell them about a que they wanted to know." Ezra nodded gravely, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "They tortured young Thomas para 3 long days. They wanted to know onde ele havia hidden a documents que ele havia found about their operation. They wanted to know who else knew about o que ele havia discovered. Mas a boy, a brave boy, never spoke. No. Suma single word." Tears began to flow down the faces to several women present, who were finally beginning to understand a magnitude de tragedy que havia unfolded. Colonel Pemberton remained tense, his hand still near his weapon, mas conscious que any sudden movement might precipitate even greater violence. "On a third day," continued Ezra, his voice now broken com emotion, "quando they saw que ele would never speak, they did things que no human being should ever suffer. Then they killed him. They threw his body nose swamps para os alligators a eat, thinking no evidence would remain. The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of suffering from the poisoned men. Abigail stood and walked slowly to where Cornelius Blackwood was curled in agony. "You organized everything, didn't you, Mr. Blackwood?" she said, her voice loaded with hatred. "You discovered that my husband had found evidence of the operation and ordered his death. And when my son followed his father's footsteps, you ordered that he also be eliminated." Blackwood tontua deny. Mas could only manage groans de pain. O poison que Abigail havia used was slow mas inexorable. Ela wanted them to suffer before dying, exactly como her son havia suffered. "And you, Judge Wade," she continued, turning toward an agonizing magistrate, "facilitated everything with your false documents and corrupt court. How many families were destroyed by your greed?" Judge Wade managed to whisper, "Please, there is an antidote. We can make a deal." Abigail laughed again, that terrible sound that made hair stand on end. "Antidote? There is no antidote for what I did to you, just like there was no antidote for my son's suffering. Dr. Moorcock was a first to succumb completely aux effects du poison." His body convulsed violently before Il collapsed from his chair, his eyes fixing him a blank stare as his life ebbed away. His death foi relatively quick, algo que Abigail considered uma mercy que ele didn't deserve. Judge Wade and Cornelius Blackwood were still breathing, mas barely. Their faces havia acquired a bluish tint, their breathing was labored and irregular. Abigail approached each dailies, observing their final agonies, com a same scientific coldness, com que they havia planned a suffering to their victims. "You thought you could kill my family and continue living as if nothing had happened," she said, her voice low, but loaded with a fury that had been refined over months of grief. "You thought a lonely widow would not be a threat, but you underestimated the power of a mother's love and the thirst for justice that can consume a soul." The final execution, the colonel faces his destiny. Colonel Pemberton, only those main conspirators who hadn't been poisoned, was now fully alert o mortal danger in que ele found himself. His hand havia moved to his pistol, mas ele hesitated to draw it in the presence to so many innocent women and children. "Colonel Pemberton," said Abigail, turning to face him directly, "I saved something special for you. Your role in the assassination of my son was particularly personal. You didn't just help transport the victims, but it was your own hands that tortured my Thomas during those 3 terrible days." A revelation shocked even Ezra, who hadn't known this specific detail. O'Colonel's face paled, mas ele tried to maintain his military posture. "Você have no proof de isso," said ele, his voice betraying only uma slight tremor. "These are accusations de uma woman unhinged por grief." Abigail smiled, uma expression que contained not uma trace to humanity. "Proof? Ezra wasn't our only witness, Colonel. There was another person present during my son's torture, someone que você thought você havia killed, mas who actually managed to escape." Ella moved again toward a door and made uma gesture. A stumbling figure entered a library, young black man de perhaps 20 years, com visible scars on his face and hands, clearly a result de severe torture. Several dos guests gasped in horror at seeing a person's condition. "This is Marcus," said Abigail. "He was a free man who was kidnapped by your operation. He was in the same cabin where you tortured my son. He witnessed everything you did, every cut, every burn, every diabolical method you used to try to break an innocent young man." Marcus looked directly at Colonel Pemberton with eyes that burned with hatred. "You enjoyed what you did," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "I saw how you smiled when a boy screamed. You weren't just following orders, you were having fun." O'Colonel finally drew his pistol. Mas discovered que several de Abigail's slaves havia positioned themselves strategically around a room. They weren't visibly armed, mas their coordinated presence made it clear que any attempt at violence would be immediately answered. "You have a choice, Colonel," said Abigail calmly. "You can try to use that weapon and die quickly when my men tear you apart, or you can face the justice that I prepared especially for you." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The same justice you gave to my son." Judge Wade emitted uma final death rattle before his head fell forward, dead. Cornelius Blackwood was still breathing. Mas was clearly his final moments. Abigail observed each death come a satisfaction to someone who sees uma debt finally being paid, As women and children innocent present were now in total panic, Mas discovered que a doors day library havia been locked from outside. They were trapped, forced to witness Abigail's revenge until its bitter end. Please, implored Uma das Pemberton's daughters, Uma young woman to perhaps 16 years. Nos didn't do anything wrong. Please let us go. Abigail looked at a young woman with something that might have been compassion in other circumstances. You didn't do anything wrong, dear, she said softly, but your father did. And part of justice is that those we love pay for our sins, just as my Thomas paid for the sins he exposed. Colonel Pemberton tentou a maintain his military dignity, even quando Abigail's slaves disarmed him. It tied him a uma chair no centered a library. His daughters were crying desperately, begging para mercy. Mas Abigail remained implacable. Her thirst para revenge havia become uma force de nature, que could not be stopped por pleas o tears. The torture of revenge, justice served in kind. Marcus, said Abigail, addressing a young black man who havia witnessed Thomas's torture, show a colonel the same methods que ele used on meu son. Every cut, every burn, every moment de agony que meu Thomas suffered. Marcus hesitated para moment, not por lack de desire para revenge, mas because ele knew que once ele started, there would be no return. Abigail perceived his hesitation and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Ele doesn't deserve sua mercy, said Ela softly. Just como ele showed no mercy a innocent young man who fought only para justice. Thomas was just a child, Marcus, a child who died defending people like você. A mention to Thomas's suffering seemed to strengthen Marcus's resolve. Ella picked up uma das knives que Abigail havia strategically placed in a room. He approached a bound colonel. I'll start com a same cuts que você made on a boy, said Ella, his voice loaded com uma cold determination. Os screams que followed echoed through a plantation Willowbrook. Sound que would haunt a nightmares dos survivors para rest de their lives. Abigail observed every moment the torture com uma scientific attention, ensuring que Marcus replicated exactly a methods que havia been used on her son. Il started com small cuts nos arms, Marcus explained while working, his voice surprisingly calm. Cuts que hurt mas didn't kill. Il wanted a boy to suffer para uma long time before dying. Pemberton's daughters fainted uma after another, unable to bear seeing their fathers suffering. A wives and mothers do's other. Conspirators were in state to shock, some praying desperately, others simply staring fixedly at a horror who was unfolding before them. Abigail circled around a chair where Pemberton was tied, observing her work with the satisfaction of an artist contemplating a masterpiece. Now you understand, she said to an agonizing man, what my son felt during those 3 terrible days. Every cut you are receiving, he received first. Every pain you are feeling, he felt 10 times worse. Cornelius. Blackwood finally succumbed to poison, his body contracting uma last time before becoming still. Abigail barely looked at him. His death havia been human necessity, mas didn't bring her a personal satisfaction que Pemberton's torture provided. Now comes a part que ele most enjoyed, said Marcus, picking up cattle branding iron que havia been heated no fire de fireplace. Il said que permanent marks were important, que a victims should carry a scars forever, even si foi only para alguns days, before dying. O smell de burning flesh joined us other terrible odors que now permeated a library. Pemberton havia stopped screaming, not por lack de pan, mas because his vocal cords were damaged pelo effort. His eyes, however, remained conscious. Abigail havia insisted que ele remain awake para every moment to his punishment. When Colonel Pemberton finally succumbed AO's wounds inflicted by Marcus, a longest night in Plantation, Willowbrook was approaching its bloody conclusion. Abigail looked. Around a library at a carnage, Ela havia orchestrated. 7 bodies scattered pale blood-soaked room, traumatized survivors who could barely form coherent sentences, evidence meticulously organized de uma conspiracy que havia operated nas shadows para years. Dawn of justice, the legacy of unprecedented vengeance. As a first raised morning sun began to filter through a windows to library, Abigail Thornfield sat calmly in her favorite chair, surrounded pelos bodies to her enemies, a pelo silence, de justice finally fulfilled. Her hands, Ella held portrait de Thomas quando child, her face serene para a first time on months. O survivors, mainly women and children who hadn't participated in as conspiracies to their husbands or fathers, were in state to profound shock. Some have gone mad during a night, unable to process of violence they have witnessed. Others remained in traumatic silence, staring fixedly at a walls, como si they could somehow escape reality through pure force de will. Marcus and Ezra had fulfilled Abigail's final instructions, preparing everything for the discovery of the bodies by the authorities. They knew they would be arrested, possibly executed, but they also knew that they had participated in something that transcended their own lives, an act of justice in a world that rarely offered justice to the oppressed. Quando Abigail finally raised Colonel Pemberton's pistol at her own temple, her last vision was du portrait de her son. Her last words, whispered so low que only Ela herself could hear them, were, "Now nos can rest together, meu dear Thomas." O sound a gunshot echoed through Plantation, Willowbrook, como final punctuation mark, na symphony de revenge que havia played throughout a night. Com her death, Abigail Thornfield joined a husband y son ella havia avenged, leaving behind legacy que would be debated para generations. The authorities arrived at noon, alerted by one of the slaves who had been instructed to ride to town if he didn't receive a signal from Abigail by a specific time. What they found was a scene of carnage that defied comprehension. 7 bodies scattered throughout the blood-soaked library, traumatized survivors who could barely form coherent sentences, and meticulously organized evidence of a conspiracy that had operated in the shadows for years. Abigail's diary, found exactly onde ela havia promised, told the entire story in precise detail. Her words, written comma clarity to someone who havia completely accepted their destiny, explained every action. It justified every act of violence como uma necessary response to even greater crimes. Newspapers at the time struggled to make sense of the story. Some portrayed Abigail as a mad assassin who had lost her mind to grief. Others saw her as a vigilante who had done what the legal system had failed to do. The evidence she had collected about a human trafficking network was sufficient to initiate investigations that revealed corruption at several levels of government. Marcus and Ezra were arrested as expected, but the evidence left by Abigail about their coercion and the crimes of the dead men resulted in relatively lenient sentences. They lived long enough to see the American Civil War begin, and both expressed the belief that Abigail's revenge had been a harbinger of the greater conflicts to come. Plantation Willowbrook foi abandoned and eventually fell into ruins. Locals in the area reported paranormal activity para decades após o massacre, claiming que spirits de Abigail e Thomas still walked the grounds. Whether Esther's stories were true or simply a result de traumatized imaginations, a plantation became a symbol de justice que can emerge even from a most desperate circumstances. Emos years que followed o Easter massacre, como event became known, history slowly revealed a true extent dos crimes que Abigail havia exposed. As investigations initiated pelas evidence, ela havia collected discovered uma network de corruption que extended far beyond Louisiana, involving politicians, merchants, and military officers, and at least 5 states. If this disturbing and fascinating story captured your attention, and you want to discover more shocking historical cases like this, please like the video and subscribe to our channel with notifications turned on. Don't forget to watch the next video, which is currently showing up on your screen, where we explore another sinister case from American history that will leave you speechless. Thank you for watching and for being part of our community of dark history explorers.